A few months ago, a well-known paramotor pilot by the name of Anthony Vella experienced a massive collapse while flying his paramotor that ultimately led him to crashing. This crash has left a lot of people confused as to what has happened, what the takeaway was, and what they can do to avoid the same situation. In today's video, I want to do a technical analysis breaking down what exactly happened. This is not to be a criticism, this is not to diss on Anthony or place any judgment onto his choices or actions. With all of that being said, there are three things we need to understand before we can fully break down Anthony's crash. I'm going to move quickly here, so try to pay attention. The first thing we need to understand is how a paraglider gets accelerated and the effects on the paraglider when done so. There are two main ways of accelerating a glider. Number one is with your trim buckles, which are found on the D cascade of a riser, and number two is the speed bar, which is found on the A cascade of the glider. Now, typically trims account for around 40% of your acceleration and speed bar for around 60% of your acceleration, but they do make risers called PK or power attack risers that give you full 100% acceleration in just the speed bar by also releasing the trim buckle for you. So as you accelerate this glider and you reach that 100% acceleration, you have completely altered the profile of the wing. It now has gone from a very relaxed curve wing to a very flat, pointy, sharp glider going as fast as it possibly can. The other effect that is very important to understand this crash is that when a glider is fully accelerated, you cannot apply any brakes. If you apply any brakes, you will induce a collapse. Remember that in just a moment. The next thing that I want to talk about is a compression tangle. Now, a compression tangle is essentially a bunch of lines that have stuck together that can completely alter the profile of the wing, meaning it can deflect the trailing edge, it can pull your A's closer to you, it can completely change how one side of the glider is flying, it can put you much closer to stall point, much closer to a collapse. Anyways, a compression tangle can make a huge difference in how your glider is flying. So now let's move into the very last thing that you need to understand before we fully look at Anthony's crash, and that is collapses. This is not going to be a full detailed video discussing collapses. I'm making one of those as well. This is simply going to be a few key differences. One of the things that really changes as you accelerate a glider is how it handles itself in a collapse. If you take a collapse at full acceleration compared to taking a collapse at trims neutral with no speed bar applied, the difference is going to be huge. There are a handful of things that really change how a wing handles collapses, but for the sake of just today's video, we're going to discuss aspect ratio. When you fully accelerate a glider, you move your loading, aka how much weight you have on each cascade of the wing, from equally distributed across the glider to fully loaded on the leading edge. This adds a huge amount of loading on the leading edge of the wing, making it extremely resistant to collapses. However, what changes is your aspect ratio. As you accelerate a glider, your glider goes from an aspect ratio, which is essentially how long and skinny or short and stubby the glider is. It goes from a whole profile aspect ratio to a very slim, tiny aspect ratio. So as you accelerate and you shift loading, your aspect ratio also shifts. If you do take a collapse when fully accelerated, the likelihood that that collapse is going to be far more dynamic and far more violent is very high. With all of that now being said, and an understanding of those key factors, let's now break down Anthony's crash to see exactly what happened. Let's start from square one. Anthony Vella, the pilot in the video, is test flying a brand new glider called the BGD Luna 3. The Luna 3 is BGD's high performance paramotor glider. In one of his first, if not his first flights, one of the tests that he was focused on was top speed, or fully accelerating the glider as much as he can to see how fast the glider can physically go. During this test is when he experienced his asymmetric collapse, which led him spinning down to the ground. Now, why did this happen? The first thing that we want to look at is the compression tangle that Anthony Vella had in his glider. If you guys look at this photo right here, you can see some deformation happening on the trailing edge of the glider. This slight amount of deformation is acting as if he was pulling brakes. So it's pulling that trailing edge down just enough. It's pretending or acting as if Anthony was pulling those brakes. Now we fast forward and we look at him accelerating the glider. You can see as he presses his speed bar to test the full speed of the wing, that right as he reaches the end of the speed bar's range, that's when we receive that collapse. If you guys remember earlier in the video, as you fully accelerate the glider, you no longer can use brakes because brakes will cause a collapse. Well, this compression tangle that is slightly deforming and deflecting the trailing edge of the wing is acting as if he's pulling brake. So as he fully accelerates that glider, that deformation is acting like he's pulling brakes and it induces a collapse. So we've answered why it happened. The compression tangle deflecting and deforming the trailing edge of his wing was acting as if he was pulling brake. And as he fully accelerated that glider, that deformation collapsed the glider just like it would have if he had applied brakes. So now let's take a look closer at the actual collapse and how the glider handled itself in the collapse and what we can learn from it. Okay, let's take a look at the actual collapse itself. If we start watching, this is where we're going to see that glider take that asymmetric collapse. In this case, I would go as far as saying this is around a 70% collapse. When we take a look at a collapse, especially accelerated, we have to think about a couple different things. Firstly, the flying side of the glider is still technically flying as fast as it was. The collapsed side of the glider is no longer flying as fast as it was. Meaning, and this is an example, the flying side was doing 45 miles an hour. The collapsed side is now doing half of that at 22 miles an hour. The second thing we want to look at is that the collapsed side is now acting as a huge piece of drag. All of that fabric that is now just hitting the air is dragging the flying side that way. So now to get to the point, the flying side is still doing the same speed it was. The collapsed side is now acting as a big drag shoe. And the natural tendency of a glider when it does collapse is that the flying side of the wing is going to follow the collapsed side and dive down towards the collapsed side. Which, if we watch a little further, you will notice that the flying side of the wing did follow the collapsed side of the glider. This is the moment in which, if the pilot has the controls in their hand, they can prevent that flying side from continuing to follow that collapsed side in a situation like this. The pilot in command here did not have his brakes in his hand and does not have any ability of controlling this glider. But in this situation, had the pilot been able to apply gentle brake to his left hand, aka the flying side, he would have prevented this flying piece from continuing to follow the collapsed side, which, if we continue to watch, you'll notice it does exactly that. It continues to follow the collapsed side until you see the collapsed side has started to reopen and continue to fly. So now let's continue to watch, but we're going to switch angles. This next angle is going to show you the part where the glider has actually reopened and shot forward to continue flying. A glider, no matter the configuration, wants to fly. Don't take that as a blanket statement. It depends on a whole bunch of different things. But the glider wants to fly. Its natural inclination is to refill full of air and regain flat and level flight. However, when you've taken a collapsed, you have sucked a lot of the air out of that glider and it needs to refill with that air, and its natural tendency is going to be to shoot forward really aggressively to refill full of that air and get back to its normal flying configuration. Which, if we watch, this glider actually shoots forward just like any glider would when it's wanting to refill from air from a big collapse like this. Had the pilot in command had the ability to apply brakes to prevent that glider from again overflying him and passing the horizon, which is the point where it goes to collapse again, he could have recovered this right here. If he had altitude, had controls, and was able to stop it from overflying, he could have probably untwisted from this situation and regained flat and level flight. But because he didn't have altitude and he didn't have the brakes in his hands to be able to give those inputs, the glider continued to overfly him and it did recollapse, not providing any support as he continued to come down to the ground. There are two more things worth discussing. The first one is, if the pilot had had more altitude, would the glider had recovered and regained flat and level flight? And the second one is, if the pilot had been able to throw his reserve, would it have saved him in this crash? Would it have deployed before he hit the ground? I want to make it clear that these two topics is purely opinion based. This is now where my opinion is going to come in, and you're going to hear what I think in these situations. If the pilot had 1,000 feet of altitude and had not been aggressively pulling on his A's, which you can see he was doing once the glider had gone shooting forward to overfly him, I think there is a strong likelihood that the glider would have reopened and regained flat and level flight. Now, I'm not sure if it would have worked within 300 feet or 500 feet or 1,000 feet or 3,000 feet. As far as how much altitude he needed, that's a question I don't have a solid answer to. But had you given him enough altitude, I believe it would have tried to reinflate, and or the pilot would have been able to re-grab controls and get the glider back to flying flat and level like it should. Now, as far as the reserve goes, there's a lot of back and forth in the community as to whether this would have worked or would not have worked. And this, again, is just going to be an opinion. Had the pilot immediately gone for his reserve at the around 100 feet that he was at, I personally believe the reserve would have opened, and if not fully deployed, it would have mostly deployed and would help bring him down slower. I have heard of a lot of reserves and personally witnessed reserves deploy and work fully carrying the weight of the pilot within 100 feet or less. The pilot in this video was at that 100 foot or close to that 100 foot mark, and if he had been able to get it out immediately, I strongly believe that there was a high likelihood it would have at least set him down half as hard as he set down in this, or even less than that. I really believe that a reserve should have been the first go-to option and had been the thing he went for in this situation. Okay guys, let me give you my final thoughts. The first thing I want to say is that this paramotor crash paints a very false perception as to what paramotoring is. From an untrained eye, it appears as if a pilot just suddenly falls out of the sky, and after painting the whole picture, I hope you realize that that is far from the truth. The other thing that I want to add is that you, as a paramotor pilot, never need to worry about this situation. The reason I say that is because had Anthony Vella not ever applied speed bar, this crash would have never happened to him. So if you are a pilot flying around not using speed bar, this situation will never happen to you, because in order for this situation to happen, you have to accelerate the glider. If you as a paramotor pilot are not accelerating your glider, you're flying at trims neutral or even just trimming up, you never have to worry about this. I did a poll recently on our YouTube channel. We had around 300 pilots vote, and out of this 300 pilots, 73% of paramotor pilots have never once used speed bar. 27% have used speed bar, which essentially means that 73% of paramotor pilots will literally never put themselves in this situation and cannot put themselves in this situation unless they decide to start using speed bar. The remaining 27% of paramotor pilots do need to keep in mind that compression tangles deflecting a trailing edge, which is a very oddball, one-off, rare occurrence, can put you in this situation. If you are a pilot who is regularly applying speed bar, it is important that you are maintaining a higher altitude when you are doing so that you have more time to work out problems. It is also important that you always fly with a reserve. A reserve parachute is essentially an oh crap button, a second chance at life, and that thing that you use when everything else fails. As someone who has been flying for over a decade, I have never used it, but you will not catch me flying my paramotor without one. I just do not think it is worth the risk not having a reserve parachute. So to put it all into a final conclusion, this is something that's a very one-off, rare, odd chance. You have to be applying speed bar, you have to happen to have a compression tangle, and all of the things have to happen at a low altitude where you don't have enough time to respawn and without a reserve that you cannot throw to save yourself. You piece all of those pieces together, and now you have what happened here. I want to add, Anthony, this video is not by any means to diss on you, to criticize you, or to place judgment on your actions or choices. This video is only to be a technical analysis. This video was only to answer questions new paramotor pilots have continued to have relating to this crash. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.